Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the podcast. We have a very special guest today, Anita Bailey, PhD, the author of Cold Times. She hasn't been on the show for 6 years, and we thought we'd have her back on the show because what better time to have Anita back when World War III may be about to start? Welcome to the show, Anita.
Thank you. I'm delighted to see you. Well, talk to you again. And I'm looking forward to a good conversation today.
Well, let's first get this off of my shoulder. Cold Times, which was published quite a few years ago, preparing for the mini ice age, is, I think, your exclusive book.
Well, I have 12 prior books, but they're in different fields.
Oh, interesting. Well, this is a no-holds-barred guidebook to surviving the coming mini ice age or any catastrophe, in my opinion, including solar flares or, let's say, EMP attacks. It covers best locations, heating, storing, growing food and herbs, water collecting, filtering. It's basically a prepper's Bible. And Leah is always swooning about this book.
I was about to say I've cited your book, Anita, on our show again and again and again, whether it's relating to grand solar minimum or some other potential difficulty up ahead. It's very useful.
Well, thank you, Leah. I appreciate that. And, you know, when I wrote that in 2016, 2017, there was nothing in my head about the whole situation from 2020 onward. But anybody who took to heart the ideas in this book and any other prepping channel or prepping book sure had a lot easier time than folks who didn't.
Indeed. I can definitely say that advice in this book would have helped anybody through any of the conditions through the pandemic. No, for sure.
Oh, yeah.
And even if you're clueless, you can learn everything from this book without knowing anything. It has recipes in it for how to make bread, how to make beer, make wine, how to tan hides, how to calculate how much plant you need for your group. I mean, so it's basically an encyclopedia for a grid down scenario, which very well may be in our near future.
It's certainly in the present time right now in the Pacific Northwest, where I was just reading 600,000 without power. That's a lot of people who are going, it's dark in here.
Yeah. Yeah, and lots of people that really don't have any idea how to deal with not having that electricity that were so useful. So I think everybody should read this book.
Can you see the screens I'm sharing, Leah?
I can, yes.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, we've got the power outage map up here, Anita, and it was over 600,000 this morning, but it's now down to just about 500,000.
Oh, good.
But that is a large portion of the entire populace. Washington State only has, I think, 2 million customers. So this is a quarter of the state.
Oh, my. That's pretty horrifying.
Right. Go ahead.
How long has this been going on?
It started about 12 hours ago. It was one of the rarest instances where the Cascades got blizzard warnings in 4 counties in November. That rarely happens. So there's a blizzard going on. The traffic lights don't work. There's probably people stranded everywhere right now as we're talking.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you go out shopping and the lights go out and you can't buy your product. The machines aren't working. Hopefully there's generators in a lot of places and they have some backup power, but you don't know how long this kind of outage will last. If it's taking down lines, it takes a while to put those babies back up.
Indeed. You know, I chuckle because we have a similar kind of problem that pops up in Pagosa Springs somewhat frequently, where our main telecommunications company, there's a lot of problems with our main telecommunications company, and the communication lines will go down. And then the next thing you know, nobody in town can buy anything. You know, it's different than the electric going out, but it
Yeah.
creates a similar kind of problem. And I keep saying that the town should sue the telecom because of the economic loss that occurs in one day is
Oh, yeah.
enormous.
Yes,
You know, and
exactly. That's true.
yeah. And
Yeah.
obviously
So
the same kind of thing would happen with an electrical outage.
Mhm.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's very frequent in Pagosa that it's cash only in our town because of these outages.
Oh
And like
my.
and most tourists coming through, like they don't have cash. They doing everything on their phone or their card.
All right. Or I'll just stop at the ATM and pick up some cash.
I'm
Yeah.
amazed by how many people don't carry cash.
It,
You know, you know, we have chickens, right? So I sell eggs sometimes, and I only take cash, for the most
true.
part. You know, I'll accept like a PayPal payment or whatever, but I somewhat frequently run into people who don't carry any cash on a regular basis, and I find that odd
Yeah.
myself.
Yeah. And I think we're going to see some changes in the public behavior like that as people go through these situations. You're trying to buy something and they're only going to take dollars and you don't have any. And
Right.
so eventually it sinks in that I better carry some cash. Hopefully. I keep my fingers crossed.
Yeah, that's the single greatest prep I believe you can have. I recommend $200 in cash on your person because it can get you out of harm's way. If you need a tow, you never know what's going to happen. And if you drive into town to go shopping and the computers are down, well, now you can still buy the stuff you need.
Oh, yeah, exactly. I had sort of a similar situation. I was driving out in the rural area and blew a tire and went to put the spare on and couldn't get it to fit. I was carrying the wrong size brilliantly. And managed to get a little flat fix in it. That's another must-have in your vehicle.
Hmm.
And limped to a tire place, and their ATMs were down. Fortunately, I had some cash on me, was able to get a new tire. But if I didn't, how long would I have been sitting there waiting to get it going?
Yeah.
Forever,
Well,
probably.
right. Well, and the interesting thing about cash, you know, it's one thing if you have a strong sense that the emergency, let's say the electrical outage is temporary, but if we're actually talking about a world where the grid is down for an indefinite period of time, then I kind of feel like the utility of cash goes away, right? Because
Mm,
now in a system like that, it's just a piece of paper.
right.
And so in that respect, in my view, you know, I believe in having cash, but I also believe in having things like precious metals and prepped goods that you're willing to trade away, right? Because these
That's,
things have some real intrinsic value.
yes, this is very true. Cash is good as long as people believe in it, as long as there's confidence in the government that it's going to be worth something. But if you're in a grid down for 2 weeks, we've been in ice storms that lasted that long, and they're not getting the power up, and people start looking around for other things to do. If it lasted any longer than 2 weeks, a month, then we're back to basic bartering, and that's just the reality. If you have no confidence in what you're using, you're just not going to use it. I heard years ago that in Alaska there was a general, and it's probably changed now, but this was years ago, generalized policy that someone who wrote a check who is reliable, that check could be used just like currency. So somebody wrote you a check for $15 and you want to go into the supermarket, you put it and pay for your product with that and get change. And then the supermarket might use that check later to pay somebody's change back. So checks would circulate until they were, almost falling apart.
Hmm.
Uh, but I don't know what's going on up there now. I haven't been to Alaska, but I always thought that was very interesting that people were willing to accept the checks of strangers in lieu of other means of payment.
That is very interesting. You know, it suggests what you would call a high trust society, right?
Yeah,
Where you can just
I've heard of
generally,
those.
yeah, right. And you
Yeah.
know, I don't think the US is generally considered to be a high trust society, but I do find it interesting that even our grocery store here does take checks. I don't think they're circulating them the way
No.
Alaska did, but you know, I do see people writing checks in the grocery fairly often, and I find that interesting because if we were back on the East Coast where we came from, that would not be happening.
Oh yes, yeah, uh-huh. That was one of the. Of course, we moved to the Ozarks back in the '80s, but already out in California, where we came from, you couldn't buy gasoline with a check, and here you still can, even
Hmm.
today.
Hmm.
And but of course, this is a small area. It doesn't have a lot of transient traffic through it, so it's uh, an area where if you have a check with a address in the area, you're probably going to honor it because they know where you live.
Exactly. An
Yeah.
interesting side note, the sun set in Alaska yesterday in Barrow, and it won't rise again until January 21st.
Mm.
Ooh. Ooh.
Oh,
Yikes.
yeah. Can
Yeah.
you
That.
imagine that? 2 months of darkness?
Yeah. Well, it's
Personally, I don't
offset
think.
by.
Go ahead,
Go ahead.
Anita.
Oh, I was going to say it's offset by the 2 months of summer where the sun never goes down.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think I would fare very well in that environment myself. I think I would get very depressed in the darkness and then I would never sleep in the light.
Yes, that's it.
Well,
I understand
if you
libraries
guys
do
haven't
well there.
heard, okay, if you guys haven't heard, there were undersea cables cut in the Baltic Sea this morning, which
Yeah.
disrupts communication in Europe, and all communication between Lithuania and Sweden was cut. And at
Ooh.
the same time, Russia is building nuclear resistant bomb shelters. And this all comes after Biden gave the okay to use long range missiles so we could shoot into Russia. It appears as if they're intentionally starting World War III before Donald Trump can get into office. What are your thoughts?
Leah?
uh, that's very interesting. I mean, it's really so simple to start World War III these days, right? Like there's so much that you can do to disrupt cooperation and communication relatively easily. And it's just a question of kind of trusting other countries not to do these things. Like we were talking on our show last weekend about tsunami bombs, the technology of tsunami bombs, which is relatively simple. You could cause massive upheaval with something that's not that hard to come by, and yet we typically don't do it. So the there's so much that rests on diplomacy and the perception of actions taken. So to be arming Ukraine with these long range missiles presents such a threat that I'm really not surprised that Russia might respond in a hostile fashion. And I don't really blame them for that. Um, so yeah, I don't know what's going to happen here, and I don't know what the point of doing this is, except that it does seem like the war hawks in the United States are insistent that the war continue, and that's really sad because this could be ended and a lot of lives could be saved.
Oh, yes, yes. Could be ended. Just get together at a table and sign the paper. That's all it takes. We'll work out
Hmm.
the details. And yet, there's the willingness to do that doesn't seem to be there. It is just kind of a joy to see that the Russians are building protection for their people, and how different that is from this country, where somebody digs a bomb shelter and they're considered Looney Tunes. Not so much now as it used to be, perhaps, but nevertheless, that their government structure is population focused, and that's that's heartening. The fact that their government has not taken a hard line and said, "Look, you did this, and we're going to do that," uh, is also kind of refreshing. But then it only has to last until the new administration in this country gets in, and their approach has been that they prefer peace.
Hmm.
And peace and prosperity is a good thing to aim toward. So I got my fingers crossed, but I don't have confidence that the good will necessarily occur.
You know, you raise an interesting point about the perception of, building underground bunkers and how that's treated here in the U.S. because, we do have a lot of elites in the U.S. that do build their own underground bunkers, right?
Yes.
Right, but it's certainly not encouraged for the regular populace. If you're part of the regular populace and you do this, you're considered a conspiracy theorist. But yet we have the elites doing it in preparation for, I don't know what's in their heads, but I mean, I can think of lots of reasons to build an underground bunker. So it's
Yeah.
it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the biggest fad since last we talked. Let's say in the last 3 years, the posh billionaire bunker, everyone's got them. And
Oh,
there's
yeah.
companies thriving building these huge underground structures.
Mhm. Yeah. Your own bowling alley, your own movie theater, your weekend outing bar down in your basement, and golly, that sure would be nice. I can't afford it, and therefore I'm reduced to one of those Looney Tunes who's out there with a shovel digging into the side of a hill. Not
And then
quite
you
that
have
bad.
your neighbors, making up stories about you and stuff. We've had that
Oh,
happen a few times. We've sort of
oh
heard
no, is that
through the
right?
grapevine, that other people have this perception of us that we're like some militia group or something. We're like, what? Why don't you just come talk to us and then you can find out what's going on here?
Well, sometimes it's good to have a reputation like that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
that's true. There is a benefit to that as well.
Well, let's talk about what are the real world implications if we do enter World War III of some sort. It's going to be limited to Europe, in my opinion, because Russia has already threatened to send 3 nuclear bombs to the UK, which would end the war immediately. And so I don't think he's going to be sending bombs over here. It'll be more localized because it's NATO that's encroaching him. The United States isn't encroaching him. It's the NATO countries that we're funding. But what happens is there's always food shortages during world wars. Things stop and that everything gets focused on the war effort. So it's key to have some kind of plan, long-term plan for food security.
Absolutely. One of the ways to determine what happens in the future is to consider what happened in the past. And the last big world war, the real war, the United States was largely agricultural. Of course, there were still cities, and there was manufacturing, and there was the ability to convert those manufacturing facilities into war production. We don't have that anymore. I
Mm.
mean, the local Lazy Boy plant cannot be converted to an ammo plant. It's just not going to happen. And while we look around and we hear about food processing facilities suddenly, burning up for no reason anybody can figure out, and livestock being killed off in these gargantuan numbers because one of them sneezed, and it makes me look at that and question my own worldview that these businesses exist to make money and to help people. I threw that worldview out a number of years ago, but many people still have that concept. My little town here had its primary business was a Tyson plant, chicken processing, and there was a number of chicken houses around the area where people would raise the chickens and they'd be brought to the plant, processed, and then they end up in your supermarket. Well, Tyson announced about a year ago that it was shutting the plant down. Boom. And it gave about a month's notice. And of course, this is a town with a population of 1,800, and 1,500 people worked in the plant.
Ugh.
So, and interestingly, a number of the employees there were brought in from Somalia. So we had a really good-sized Somalian population in the town. Well, Tyson closed, half the population of the town disappeared. I don't mean they vaporized, they moved somewhere else. Some of them followed Tyson to New York and other locations. Some went to Minneapolis, and some went wherever people go when their business is gone. And the local businesses, clearly, they're hanging on by a thread right now because we do have a little tourism coming through here. But that was a shocking devastation to the town. And other towns in the Missouri area that had similar things happen are also having a similar effect. So what does a population do with just an ordinary economic hit like that? Well, I can tell you what happened here in my little area is people started growing those backyard gardens, seriously growing them. And that's one way to prevent the food issues that come from not having enough money to buy it from taking over your life. Certainly, during a World War situation or a European war situation, stuff is just not going to be available. Even Martin Armstrong, the economist who has a computer program that he's been using for years, and it's very high accuracy predictive rate, or forecasting rate, I guess would be the correct word. He's saying food shortages are coming because there isn't product, not because of inflation or money not going far enough, but because we can't get the stuff. So ultimately, your backyard is your best source. And for people who haven't gardened and haven't produced their own food, you have to look at not just putting that tomato plant into the pot, but how much it can produce for you to eat, how many of those plants you're going to need to produce enough, and then once you work out your numbers, you have to ask yourself, what happens if I lose my harvest? That, 3-minute hailstorm just when the tomatoes are ready to pick, and you've got tomato paste in your field. And it's not the way we're accustomed to thinking. And if you haven't thought about it, it's virtually overwhelming. Just trying to figure out how many tomatoes do I need. One of the sorriest, saddest experiences I had a couple of years ago is I was at Lowe's and I was looking at their spring plants and starts and things like that, and seeing what was available. And there was a fella my age, I'd say probably retired age, looked like he had been a businessman, had that look and feel about him, and he was querying one of the sales reps about a cherry tomato plant. And it was pretty good size. It had little tomatoes all over it. And he was asking, how do I take care of it? How many tomatoes will I get from it? And the salesperson it just has this flabbergasted look on her face. as if she could tell him, you're going to get 4 quarts or whatever. The guy had no idea. And, I mean, cherry tomatoes are one of the easiest plants you can grow. You drop a seed on the ground, you got tomato plants all over the place.
Yeah, they're spreading in our one of our rigid greenhouses. They spread in the winter. They just take over a whole room.
But I just looked at this poor guy. I mean, he was not poor, but this sad individual, and realized he represents probably a vast majority of people out there who just have no idea, just no idea.
Yeah, we've been advocating to get started on gardening because you need to hurry up and fail before you starve to death. Gardening is mostly failure, and you've got to be relentless, and which is why you should be planting like every week, succession planting, and using a diverse number of crops. We've been advocating for rigid greenhouses in the case of a catastrophe like a hailstorm, so you don't starve to death. And really diversify. Lee and I just picked up our first breeding pair of meat rabbits to diversify our sources of protein.
Yes.
I mean, it really is a whole. Sorry, go ahead, Anita.
No, I was just emphasizing his point. Diversity. The more things you have, the more fallback you have. And the more fallback you have, the more protection you have.
Yeah, that actually leads in perfectly to what I was going to say. Just that, the story you tell, about a corporation, right? Really essentially having all of the economic control of a whole town. I mean, it's very similar to the agriculture model we certainly currently have, right? The mono agricultural model where, if the climate changes and shifts, you can't just like pick up and move it. So in that respect, local, regional is much more flexible and adaptable. And it's a parallel thing to, in my opinion, to having kind of the diversity where you're doing everything on a small scale so that you have a lot of potential options rather than what most people are living in, which is a system that's fully established and set up, and there's 5 big corporations controlling the entire supply, and you just buy into it and then that's the end of it. And I think that generally speaking, consumers are kind of really trapped by that because it now means that they don't know how to do it themselves. And as Diamond rightly points out, it takes quite a lot of failure to even how to figure out how to do it another way. And thus why we constantly advocate to people that they get started now rather than wait, because you just can't expect that you're just going to start gardening and you're going to have this plethora of food like magic, because it just clearly does not work that way. I mean, here we've been at this for 10 years and we still have a lot to do, in my opinion, in order to be fully prepared for a catastrophe,
Yes, absolutely. And that's hard to transmit to people who haven't done it, because they see the seed packs and the beautiful picture of the ripe fruit on it or the big plant, and they don't make the connection that, oh gosh, who was it that some years ago said it's really easy to grow food? You just put a corn in the ground and then boom, you got corn. It was like, what a disconnect from reality that is. Yeah, maybe you get 1 ear of corn. Good, that'll feed you.
And corn is difficult to grow. You have to really pollinate it correctly, or you're not going to get good yields.
Yes, that is true. Planting and knowing what direction your wind comes from during the time when the corn is pollinating is crucial.
Yeah.
If you plant in long rows that run opposite the wind, then the wind will carry the pollen in places that you want it. If you plant it so that it runs with the wind, it's all gone. It's all gone. All your pollen goes away, goes to your neighbors.
I mean, really basic things like basic knowledge, like just even, I think most people don't even know how long their growing season is, right? Like for us, that's really critical. We only have a 90-day growing season here, and so if you're in a short growing period, like us, and you don't know that, I mean, you're going to have a tough time. We have to make a lot of changes, and we have to be very specific about, in many cases, about what strains of seeds we used, because we typically can't do corn unless we pick short growing season corn. And then it also needs to be done in hoop houses because it's just not warm enough
Oh,
otherwise,
yeah.
So, this is just lots of little itty bitty changes that you have to make that way in respect to your individual conditions.
Yes. Yeah. There is a variety called painted mountain corn.
Oh
It's
yeah, we know all about it.
Oh, okay. Has that worked for you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've been developing our own land race for 8 years, and
Oh, wonderful.
I've been
Yes.
selecting for the Starburst. So we've got Starburst Painted Mountain.
Oh my.
Yeah.
That sounds lovely. And region specific, it tolerates your weather, it knows your soil. You
Mm-hmm.
can't have better than that.
Yeah, and it has a sweet phase and a dent phase, so it's a really great all-purpose corn.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Now, I've been trying to get it going here. It grows well. It's early. It's really nice, but the humidity in this area is really hard on it, and we
Ooh.
usually end up with fungus problems.
Mm.
So, although I really like it for its positive things, I don't think it's going to be adaptable as it is to this area,
Right.
which is a shame.
Yeah. Yeah. But, surely there's something else that is adaptable or even can be made adaptable, right? Like
Oh
successive
yeah,
years of planting certain things in a climate will help that plant adapt to the climate, stuff like that.
yeah, yes, yeah, and especially now as we see these climate shifts and changes in weather patterns, we need plants that are adaptable,
Yeah.
that have the genetic capacity to adjust to a lot of different things. So I'm a big fan of crossbreeding and bringing in animals and plants that have traits that are beneficial if you got a hot year or you got a cold year.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So what's your prediction on the upcoming solar cycle? I mean, you did write the book, How to Prepare for the Mini Ice Age.
Yes.
Cycle 26 is slightly larger than 20, or cycle 25 is slightly larger than 24. What are your
Hmm.
thoughts going into the next cycle?
I think the next one will be the one we were expecting this time,
Yeah.
and that is primarily the reason I think that is because the other background elements are lining up with that, and we have to bring in the changes in Earth's magnetic field and
Mm-hmm.
the effect of sunspots, and you can look at the climate now, and it's different than it was 3-4 years ago, which was different than it was 3-4 years before that. But then it's always shifting. So I have 75% confidence that we're heading toward the mini ice age phase. And I don't think we can miss that. We can exclude it from our thinking. But even if the weather continues just perfectly fine, we still have a whole economic collapse to go through.
Yeah. Or even, I mean, you mentioned the magnetic field of Earth and the magnetosphere, right? We have a weakening magnetosphere, which is the reason why, let's say in the May solar storms, we saw aurora all the way down to down to the U.S. border with Mexico. And that alone presents its own potential dangers in the sense that our magnetosphere continues to weaken. And should we have a large enough solar flare or set of solar flares or long duration solar flares that could take out our grid? I mean, that's certainly possible in the future at any point. So,
Yes.
there's a lot to take account of. And it's interesting that we're kind of getting to the point where there's such a wide array of potential catastrophes that have a decent likelihood of happening, right? An economic collapse, a solar flare that takes out the grid. Like there's a whole list of things that we talk about on our Saturday show all the time. And like Diamond said in the beginning of our call here, your book is a great prep for all of those things, which is fantastic.
Yes. Well, good. I'm glad you think so. Yeah, it's. I think we're looking towards some very turbulent times. even with this, the change in the administration, which in my area, there's a sense of cautious optimism with that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And cautious probably because of the hysteria that goes with this change.
Yeah.
So does that mean the people who are disaffected are going to become more visibly disaffected? Is it going to become something kinetic? I personally doubt it. I think that the Harris side has lost heart, and they're very disorganized now, mentally disorganized.
Mm-hmm.
And I have questions that they will be able to gather themselves enough to cause real serious interventions. But then I could be wrong, because I don't hang out with a lot of those people. I don't know if they're plotting things or if they're just at home, sobbing.
Well, in a way, you could probably say that, okay, like you used the word hysteria, and I have lots of questions about the legitimacy of such hysteria, right? Because some of this hysteria is based on ideas of things that will happen for which there's really no evidence that they will happen. So what I'm suggesting is that the political hysteria is perhaps not that different than the hysteria you might encounter in the face of like a natural calamity, right? A solar flare that takes out the grid. And so either way, you're potentially dealing with people who are panicking because they don't know what to do and how to survive. And obviously there's a hysteria in that as well. And to me, that is one of the biggest dangers in the face of a calamity or political upheaval or whatever. So it's kind of not any different, than prepping for a natural catastrophe in one respect. And this is in regard to dealing with other people, who may not be prepared and may be panicking.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, if you have a grid down situation or a really individually affecting economic collapse or crash or stock market or whatever, that's quite a bit different, because it has the physical ramifications.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to get food, or it's so expensive you can't afford it, and people are knocking on their neighbors' doors asking if they can borrow some rice or some flour, and then they get desperate, and now it gets ugly. Mm-hmm. That's different than this political hysteria, because these people they're sitting behind their screens in a comfortable room with lights on and food nearby, and they're living in an imaginary world of threat. Mm-hmm. Now, that can feel very real, and I'm not discounting that their emotional experience, because they mm-hmm. feel threatened, mm-hmm. But it's not a true threat.
Right.
Nobody's marching them out of their house into camp. It's just not happening.
Right.
So, and another thing is the gals who are cutting their hair off to show that they're so disaffected with this thing. That to me, that looked almost like people who are going through mental issues, and they're cutting their arms. They're attempting to show their unhappiness with physical damage to themselves.
Yeah.
And that. People who do that aren't a threat to the rest of the world. They're only a threat to themselves. But it's problematic, because how do you get somebody out of that mental state?
Yeah.
How do you take a group of people who can't hear what you're saying and try to bring them into reality?
Yeah.
I don't have an answer for groups of people. I can work with an individual, but even then, to get through those, I don't know if it is in fact the mass formation concept here.
Right. Right.
But we have people who, when they hear the trigger words, they instantly convert to rage.
Yeah.
It's not that they grumble or, when my presidential candidates in the past have lost, and there's been a whole bunch of them, you just go, oh, geez, people are so dumb. And then you move on, right? You just go, well, 4 years from now, we'll take it back. But this state that people are in, if you question their thought process, they instantly have the barrier that goes up, and it cannot be breached. So I don't know what to do about that. Maybe a hard Zen slap from reality is what it takes. Where they go to the market and nobody will take their debit card.
Well, it's interesting. They won't be reproducing. A study that just came out showed that women are getting their tubes tied at a 1,200% higher rate since the election.
Oh my God.
That is insane.
Even when you're not talking about somebody that's completely hysterical about the political situation, it's still tremendously difficult to kind of get through. The main problem, as I see it, is that we have kind of two completely different sets of information. There's the information that's spouted by legacy media, and then there's all the other information. And I have a lot of personal experience with this because I know a lot of people who work with the other set of information. And but even there, it's kind of the same thing as what you just described, where you 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 kind of present the information hoping to get through, and then there's this wall that goes up. So while it might not be hysteria, there's some kind of, maybe it's the mass formation psychosis, maybe it's brainwashing, whatever it is. I mean, the good news is there's more and more people sort of waking up every day.
Yes. And mainstream legacy media has collapsed since the election.
Yeah,
I mean, like MSNBC picked up 26,000 views on one of their weekend shows. That's like worth $100 in ad revenue, and they've got studios and $1 million celebrities. So I don't think legacy media is going to be around in 5 years.
They may not. I just heard MSNBC is going to be sold. I just heard that this morning.
Yes.
Yeah.
Who's going to buy it?
Well, right. I mean, I don't know. That's the first thing I thought of, like, who wants to buy this? Like, what a terrible investment that is.
So but
maybe somebody buys it who kind of wants to turn it around. So that would be interesting. But
yeah, and I think the good news is that the culture war, we're winning the culture war, and it's shifting because people are realizing how crazy those other people are.
Yeah, it's what I still can't get through my head is how those people don't realize it's crazy. That they can look at a woman and say, I don't know what a woman is. I mean,
right.
What are you missing here? Where is the gap? And these are not, people who are mentally deficient. They're people in high places. And then again, I say, well, maybe they're just saying that because their job's at stake, and they gotta toe the line.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
I can confidently believe that more than they're just baffled by what female and male is.
Right. Well, and the thing that always kind of gets me too is, like, I mean, I can think of certain issues where if you go back like 10 years, let's say the progressive stance on a particular issue might have been much more sane or moderate, and now it's not. And I kind of I always wonder, do you have a memory of what that position was 10 years ago? Like, because anyway, that's interesting.
That was the thing that boggled my mind during the pandemic, was people who had been adamantly opposed to childhood vaccination or any kind of
Hmm.
vax, or subscribing to what big pharma came out with, turned around on a dime, and they were there first in line getting their pokes.
Yeah.
I,
Well, no, and it's worse than that, right? Because and they're also telling you that you have to get your poke,
right.
and if you don't, you're a horrible person. Meanwhile, these are the same people that have believed in the past in bodily autonomy, but apparently don't believe in it anymore. In fact, quite the opposite. Or it's
Hmm.
the same thing with, you know, uh, like we were talking, Diamond and I were talking about this last week. There's the famous band Rage Against the Machine, right? It's
Hmm.
traditionally anti-authoritarian, and now they're completely authoritarian. And it's like, how can the name of your band be Rage Against the Machine, and you are spouting authoritarian ideas that everybody has to follow these certain rules and get a poke, and it's so bizarre. Like, how do you not see the irony in your own world if you're acting like that? But
Yeah, yeah. It's a stunning lack of insight into your own thought process.
yeah.
And perhaps they were always that way, and it's just showing more now. I think it's changes in the cosmic and solar radiation that are hitting Earth, and they're impacting, and the magnetic field and all of those things impacting the neuronal structure of the brain.
Mm,
So the things that should connect just ain't connecting in there. You got little short circuits going on.
interesting.
Um, and we certainly have seen that there is a connection between what's happening on the sun and human health, heart attacks, strokes, that sort
Yep.
of thing,
Yeah.
and also with an increase in anxieties that
Yeah.
accompany that.
Yes.
I know some people who are extremely sensitive to solar changes, but their consequence is generally a really bad headache or joint pain, and yet that's physiological. And a bad headache could certainly come from brain changes or muscular changes in the head, and the scalp, and things like that. So the impact is there.
Yeah.
And if some people who are highly sensitive to those energy changes um, are asked to look more deeply into their own thought processes, maybe they can't. They physiologically cannot.
Right.
So
That's an
it
interesting thing to ponder.
yeah,
Well,
it's
let's wrap this up with some
okay.
final words. We're always The purpose of this was to advocate for being prepared for an eventuality that's coming, not a question of if, it's when. Is it going to be what comes first? Is it financial collapse, the shift to digital dollars, World War III? Is it a new pandemic? Will it be a WEI7 eruption in the Mediterranean?
Hmm.
It's anyone's guess. Will a comet hit? Will Apophis hit? All these things are in the cards. And the reality is that a solar flare taking out the grid, that in a very short period of time, a few months, there is a huge population reduction.
Yes,
So, for
absolutely.
peace of mind, you need to be preparing now for something that is going to happen in the future. It's it's not Please do not continue to ride on the fairy tale train thinking that something won't happen because it always does.
Yes, yes, that's the truth. We've lived in a period of unfathomable wealth and prosperity in this country for a couple of generations, and that is a historical anomaly. Historically, people have dealt with famine, fire, flood, troubling things forever. And we are coming into the period where we no longer have the buffer that we've had for the past several generations. And it's it harms no one to grow a garden. It doesn't hurt you to get out there and hoe around plants. It's good. It's good. Get some sun and eat the best food you've ever had in your life out of your backyard.
Yeah. I think in a way, a calamity is actually an opportunity in my mind, right? Because it's the opportunity to get your hands in the soil, to be out in the sun, to actually live a fully healthy life that you've grown and produced yourself. Like, how satisfying is that?
Yeah.
And that's certainly something that we've gotten away from in our industrialized society. I mean, obviously, it's not going to be seen as an opportunity for many. And in some respects, I think that the potential for some of the slower calamities, like let's say the movement into grand solar minimum, might be a lot harder than some of the kind of shocker events that could happen, right? Like a cometary impact or a solar flare or something like that. So it'll be interesting to see which type of event people respond to better.
Yeah.
Well, don't rob yourself of the opportunity to be healthy. Food is medicine, and the pharmaceutical industry only exists today because the food that we eat is no longer medicine. So
Yes.
grow your
Yeah.
own food, nutrient dense food, eat it the moment you pick it, and you won't get sick. Your body will have all the nutrition it needs. It's that simple.
Hmm.
Yes. Yeah. That's very true. Very true.
Always a pleasure having you on the show, Dr. Bailey. We will send you a copy of this when we put it up on YouTube, and hopefully you can get to your local library and watch it where they have internet.
Oh, that sounds great. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been delightful.
Thanks so much for coming on, Anita.
Always a pleasure.